I am your host, Nero Wolfe. Let's begin our journey.
It was a Monday in October, the kind of morning where the New York mist clings to the brownstones like a damp, grey coat that hasn't been to the cleaners in a decade. Inside, the atmosphere was considerably more refined. Fritz was in the kitchen, likely engaging in a complex negotiation with a leg of lamb, and upstairs in the plant rooms, Nero Wolfe was in the middle of his 9-to-11 shift with the orchids. I was at my desk in the office, catching up on the bank statements, and wondering if I should tell Wolfe that our current balance was starting to look more like a grocery bill than a fortune. The doorbell rang at 10:14. It wasn't the frantic ring of a man in trouble or the polite tap of a bill collector. It was a single, authoritative chime that suggested the person on the other side expected the door to open by divine right. I went to the hall, pulled back the curtain, and saw a woman who looked like she'd been born in a velvet-lined box. She was in her late 60s, wearing a tweed suit that cost more than my car and a hat that looked like a very expensive bird had decided to nest on her head. "I am Eleanor Thorne," she said when I opened the door. She didn't ask if she could come in, she simply stepped past me, bringing a scent of lavender and old money into the hallway. "I am here to see Mr. Wolfe regarding a matter of historical accuracy and personal honor. I have brought a deposit." She held out a small, heavy object wrapped in a silk scarf. I took it, led her into the front room, and told her that Mr. Wolfe was currently engaged with his betters. The orchid stand wouldn't be down until 11. When the clock struck the hour, the elevator groaned and Wolfe emerged. He crossed the room with his usual monumental dignity, adjusted his bulk into the chair that was built to handle it, and sighed. He looked at the silk-wrapped object ID placed on his desk as if it were a suspicious package from a disgruntled rival. "Archie, why is there a woman in the front room who smells of mothballs and entitlement?" "That's Mrs. Eleanor Thorne," I said. "She's here for honor and accuracy." She also brought this. I unwrapped the scarf. Inside was a paperweight, a solid hunk of ancient amber, the size of a grapefruit, with a prehistoric dragonfly frozen in the center. But it wasn't the dragonfly that was interesting. Taped to the bottom was a check for $5,000. Wolfe didn't touch the amber. He leaned back, his eyes narrowing as he studied the insect trapped in the resin. The Thorne family, shipping magnates who believe the Atlantic is their private pond. "Why has she brought me a fossil?" "She says someone is trying to rewrite her late husband's will, and not with a pen." She mentioned moral sabotage. Wolfe's fingers began their rhythmic drumming on the arm of his chair. He hated taking cases that required him to leave the house, but he hated the idea of a $5,000 check going uncashed even more. Most importantly, he looked at the amber with a flicker of genuine curiosity. "Honor is a tedious client, Archie, but a prehistoric dragonfly is a rare witness. Bring her in, and tell Fritz we shall need a bottle of the Montrachet. If we are to discuss moral sabotage, we should at least have a decent vintage to wash it down." I went to the front room. Mrs. Thorne was standing by the window, staring at the street as if she were waiting for the 19th century to return. "The doctor will see you now," I said. As I led her into the office, the air in the brownstone seemed to thicken. It wasn't just the mist from outside, it was the arrival of a problem that couldn't be solved with a gun or a bribe. It was a mystery of strategy, and as Wolfe looked up at her, his eyes as cold and clear as the amber on his desk, I knew the piece of the brownstone was officially over. The entrance of the Thorne family into the brownstone was not so much an arrival as it was an occupation. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, the fog outside had thickened into a damp, suffocating wool, but the atmosphere inside the office was becoming even more crowded. Eleanor Thorne had remained in the front room, a silent sentinel of the old guard, while I played doorman to the next generation. They didn't come together, they arrived in intervals, each one bringing a fresh draught of cold air and a different flavor of resentment. First was Sterling Thorne, the eldest son and the current captain of the family's shipping empire. He was a man who looked like he had been built out of mahogany and iron, wearing a double-breasted suit that fit him like a coat of mail. He didn't bother with the coat rack, he simply handed his wet overcoat to me, as if I were a piece of furniture, and marched into the office. He didn't look at Wolfe, he looked at the amber paperweight on the desk with a gaze that could have stripped the varnish off the baseboards. "This is an absurdity, Wolfe," Sterling boomed, his voice a baritone that seemed to rattle the books on the shelves. My mother is chasing ghosts. The diaries are a family matter, not a subject for a private investigator who spends his days looking at plants. My father's legacy is perfectly safe in my hands. Wolfe didn't look up from the small glass of beer Fritz had just placed at his elbow. A legacy is never safe, Mr. Thorne. It is a fragile thing, susceptible to the rot of time and the clumsiness of heirs. Your mother believes the rot has already set in. Next came Vivian Thorne, Sterling's sister, a woman who looked like she had been born with a silver spoon and was currently trying to figure out how to use it as a weapon. She was younger, sharper, and dressed in a style that suggested she found her family's history to be a tedious interruption to her social calendar. She sat in the yellow chair, crossing her legs with a deliberate rustle of silk, and looked at me with a mixture of boredom and calculation. Sterling is just worried about the optics, Vivian said, her voice a cool contrast to her brother's heat. He thinks if people start poking around in Father's old journals, they might find out that the Thorne fortune wasn't built on hard work alone. But Mother is the one who's really panicked. She thinks honor is something you can keep in a box. I just want this over with so I can get back to my life. The final arrival was Julian Vane, the family's legal counsel, and, if the rumors were true, the man who knew where all the Thorne bodies were buried. He was thin, grey, and possessed the kind of quiet, unassuming presence that usually indicates a man who listens much more than he speaks. He bowed slightly to Wolfe, then to Mrs. Thorne, and took a seat by the window, opening a leather portfolio with the practiced grace of a man who lives in the margins of other people's lives. Mr. Wolfe, Vane said, his voice a dry rustle, I have advised against this. The diaries are indeed sensitive. If the original has been replaced by a forgery, as Mrs. Thorne claims, the implications for the company's current contracts could be catastrophic. We are dealing with a delicate equilibrium. Wolfe sat perfectly still, his bulk immobile, his eyes moving from Sterling to Vivian, and finally settling on the lawyer. The Brownstone, usually a sanctuary of silence and order, was now a theatre of conflicting ambitions. I stood by the door, watching the play of shadows on the wall. The tension was palpable, a low-frequency hum that made the hair on my arms stand up. A delicate equilibrium, Wolfe repeated, the words sounding like a heavy stone dropped into a pond. A shipping empire built on secrets, a son who fears the past, a daughter who finds it an inconvenience, and a lawyer who manages the silence. And in the center of it all, a missing diary that supposedly turns a patriot into a traitor. You have all come here to discourage me, yet your very presence suggests that the forgery is not the only thing that is false in the Thorne household. How dare you, Sterling snapped, stepping toward the desk. I dare quite a lot for $5,000, Mr. Thorne, Wolfe said, his voice dropping into a register of absolute authority, including the right to observe that none of you seems particularly interested in finding the original journal. You are all focused on the consequences of the theft, not the identity of the thief. That is a distinction that interests me. I watched Julian Vane's hands. He was tapping a gold fountain pen against his knee, a rhythmic, nervous tick that didn't match his calm voice. Vivian was staring at the dragonfly in the amber, her expression unreadable, while Sterling looked like he was about to burst a blood vessel. The disruption was complete. The sanctity of the Brownstone had been breached by the Thorne drama, and Wolfe was loving every second of it, even if he would rather die than admit it. He reached for his beer, took a slow, methodical sip, and looked at the four of them with the detached curiosity of a scientist examining a new species of beetle. Archie, Wolfe said, his eyes never leaving the family. It seems we have a house full of reluctant heirs. Tell Fritz lunch will be for 6. If we are to unravel the Thorne honour, we shall do it over a proper meal. And Archie, keep an eye on the hall. I have a feeling that when the Thorne family is gathered in one room, the truth is usually hiding in another. I moved to the hallway, feeling the weight of the case beginning to settle. The players were on the stage, the stakes were high, and the Brownstone was no longer just a home, it was a trap. The dining room of the Brownstone is a place of ritual, but today the ritual felt like a wake where the mourners were all primary suspects. Wolfe sat at the head of the table, his presence so massive it seemed to pin the room together, while Fritz moved between the guests with the silent grace of a ghost. The menu was poached salmon with a mousseline sauce that deserved more attention than it was getting. but the Thorne family was too busy sharpening their knives for each other to notice the food. As I sat at the far end of the table, I began to catalogue the grievances that were boiling just beneath the surface of the polite conversation. Sterling Thorne was the first to let his guard slip. He ate with a mechanical efficiency, his eyes fixed on Julian Vane, as if he were trying to read the lawyer's private thoughts through his forehead. Sterling's grievance was one of power. He had been the heir apparent for 40 years, but the missing diary apparently contained evidence that his father had intended to bypass him in favor of a board-controlled trust. To Sterling, the theft wasn't about honor, it was about the survival of his throne. If the original journal vanished and the forgery took its place, Sterling's position as the iron-fisted captain of the line would be compromised by a dead man's second thoughts. Every time he looked at his mother, I saw a flicker of resentment's son, who had lived in the shadow of a legend and was now finding that the shadow had teeth. Vivian Thorne, on the other hand, was playing a different game. She barely touched her salmon, preferring to toy with her wine glass and watch her brother's growing irritation with a look of faint, bored amusement. Her complaint was classic of a neglected daughter. I knew from my preliminary notes that she had been cut out of a significant portion of the estate after a particularly loud scandal in Paris 3 years ago. If the forgery suggested the late Elias Thorne was a traitor, it might be enough to tie the entire estate up in litigation for a decade, which suited Vivian perfectly. She didn't need the shipping line to succeed, she just needed enough chaos to ensure that Sterling didn't get his hands on the liquid assets. To her, the Brownstone was just another stage for a performance she'd been giving all her life. Then there was Julian Vane. The lawyer sat with a stillness that was almost unnatural, his expression a mask of professional neutrality, but I noticed the way he checked his pocket watch every 5 minutes, a rhythmic, nervous habit that suggested he was waiting for a phone call that wouldn't come. Vane's grievance was the most subtle. He had been the architect of the Thorne secrets for 30 years, and he was the only one who truly understood the damage the original diary could do. If the journal revealed that Vane had been the one to facilitate the political arrangements Elias Thorne had made during the war, he wouldn't just lose his career illegality, would follow him to the grave. He was a man who had built a life on the discretion of others, and now the primary source of that discretion was in the hands of a thief. Even Eleanor Thorne, our client, wasn't immune to the atmosphere of mutual loathing. She sat across from Wolfe, her back as straight as a spear, but her hands were trembling slightly as she held her fork. Her grievance was the most tragic. She was realizing that the family she had built was held together by nothing more than greed and the very resin that trapped the dragonfly on Wolfe's desk. She looked at her children and her lawyer, not with affection, but with a cold, analytical suspicion that matched Wolfe's own. "It is a remarkable thing," Wolfe said, his voice cutting through the clatter of silverware like a bell. 4 individuals, all bound by the same name and the same history, yet none of you can agree on the nature of the loss. Mr. Sterling Thorne fears for his authority, Miss Vivian fears for her relevance, Mr. Vane fears for his record, and Mrs. Thorne fears a ghost. You have turned this dining room into a gallery of grievances, and yet the thief remains invisible. Why? Perhaps because there is no thief, Wolfe, Sterling snapped, his face reddening. Perhaps my mother simply misplaced the journal, and her imagination did the rest. This entire farce is a waste of time. Imagination does not produce high-quality forgeries, Mr. Thorne, Wolfe replied, his voice dropping into that dangerous, quiet register. Nor does it plant a prehistoric dragonfly on my desk as a summons. The thief is quite real, and he is someone who knows the Thorne library, and he knows his own ambitions. He is someone who understood that by taking the original and leaving a lie, he would set the 4 of you against each other like dogs over a bone, and he has succeeded. Vivian let out a sharp, jagged laugh. Well, if we're dogs, Sterling is certainly the one with the loudest bark. But don't look at me, Mr. Wolfe. I haven't been in that library for months. It smells too much of the past for my taste. I watched Julian Vane's eyes. They had moved from the table to the hallway, where the fog was pressing against the glass of the front door. The gallery of grievances was full, the motives were served, and the tension was high enough to shatter the crystal. Wolfe reached for his wine, his fingers steady, and I knew the next step was mine. The Brownstone was holding its breath, and it was time for me to go out into the mist to find out whose footprint was on the library rug. "Archie," Wolfe said, his eyes never leaving Vane. "I believe the lunch is concluded. Guests will remain in the front room while you go to the Thorn estate. I want a full inventory of that library. I want to know who has been buying high-grade vellum in this city over the last 2 weeks. It seems our forger has a taste for the authentic." I stood up, ready for the afternoon chill. The table was a wreck of secrets and salmon, and the real work was just beginning. The fog hadn't just settled over Manhattan, it had moved in and taken up permanent residence, turning the city into a collection of blurry yellow street lamps and muffled horn honks. I pulled the collar of my topcoat up as I stepped out of the Brownstone, leaving the Thorn family to simmer in the front room. Wolfe likes his suspects where he can see them, or at least where he can hear their nerves rattling against the floorboards. But the answers were waiting for me at the Thorn estate on East 64th Street. It was a limestone fortress that looked like it had been built to withstand anything short of a direct hit from a battleship, and today it looked particularly grim. The butler, a man named Himes, who had the facial expression of a frozen turnip, let me in without a word. Had clearly been told to expect me, though his eyes suggested Head rather be showing me the exit. I went straight to the library. It was a room that smelled of old leather, wood smoke, and the kind of quiet that only comes with 100 years of being very wealthy. 3 walls were lined with books that nobody ever read, and the 4th was a massive mahogany desk that looked like it had been used to sign treaties. This was where the diaries lived, or at least where they had lived until someone decided to play editor. I spent the first hour doing the boring stuff. I checked the window locks untouched. I checked the carpet for any sign of a struggle or a stray cigar ash, nothing but the deep, pristine pile of a Persian rug. Then I got into the forgery business. Mrs. Thorn had shown me where the journal sat. The fake was still there, a leather-bound volume that looked identical to its neighbors until you opened it. I am no expert on vellum, but I've spent enough time around Wolfe's rare editions to know when someone is trying to sell me a silk purse made out of a sow's ear. The paper was too white, the ink too even. It was the work of someone who knew the mechanics of a pen but didn't have the soul of the man who'd held the original. I didn't stay home. Legwork isn't just about looking at rugs, it's about following the paper trail before it gets rained on. I headed back into the fog and made 3 stops. The first was at a high-end stationer's on Madison Avenue where the clerks treated you like a peasant unless you were wearing a diamond tie pin. I didn't have the pin, but I had a way of looking like I was about to call the police, which usually gets results. "High-grade vellum?" the clerk asked, sniffing. "We only sell that by the team to a few regular clients. It's an antique stock. It hasn't been produced in years. Give me the names," I said, "and don't tell me about privacy. I'm working for a woman who could buy this shop just to use the floor space for her galoshes." The list was short, 3 names. One was a museum, one was an eccentric poet in the village, and the third was Julian Vane. The lawyer had purchased 12 sheets of the stuff 2 weeks ago, claiming it was for a special restorative project for the Thorn archives. It was a nice, tidy lead-to, tidy for a man as smart as Vane, but it was a start. My second stop was a small, cramped print shop in the basement of an old building on 42nd Street. The man who ran it, a fellow named Sawley who had ink under his fingernails and a permanent squint, was the kind of person who knew who was forging what in the city. He didn't talk for free, but a $10 bill loosened his tongue like a glass of cheap rye. "Diary," Sawley wheezed, leaning over his press. "Yeah," I heard a whisper. Someone was looking for a specific type of iron gall ink, the kind that eats into the paper over time. Very old-fashioned, very hard to get. A guy came in here last month asking for a recipe. Tall, well-built. Looked like he was used to giving orders. "Sterling Thorn?" I asked. "I don't know the name, Archie. I just know hands." This guy had a heavy ringgold with a crest, a bird maybe, an eagle or a hawk. I felt the click. Sterling Thorn wore a signet ring with a Hawk Thorn family crest, so we had Vane buying the paper and Sterling looking for the ink. It was a beautiful setup if you liked your suspects to work in pairs, or if one of them was trying to make the other look like a primary candidate for a jail cell. The fog was even thicker when I headed for my final stop, a small private club where Vivian Thorn spent most of her afternoons. She wasn't there, but the head waiter remembered her being there the night the diary went missing. She hadn't been alone. She'd been arguing with a man who looked remarkably like a private investigator from one of the less reputable agencies in town, a man who specialized in delicate retrievals. I stood on the sidewalk, the mist dampening my face, and tried to put the puzzle together. Vane with the paper, Sterling with the ink, and Vivian with the muscle. It was a three-way split of suspicion, and each had reason to want the original journal to vanish into the fog, but something wasn't sitting right. Wolfe always says that when everyone is pointing in a different direction, you should look at the person who is standing perfectly still. I headed back to the Brownstone, my shoes squelching in the slush. I had the facts, or at least the fragments of them, and I knew Wolfe was waiting. He'd be in his chair, probably annoyed that the fog was messing with the humidity in the orchid rooms, ready to take these pieces and turn them into a noose. As I let myself into the hall, I could hear the murmur of voices from the front room. The Thorne family was still there, awaiting the verdict. Little did they know, ID just brought back enough rope to hang all three of them. Archie, Wolfe's voice rumbled from the office. "You are damp and you are late. Tell me you have something more than just a wet coat." "I've got the vellum, the ink, and a private eye in the mix," I said, walking into the room. "The fog is lifting, sir, but I don't think the Thorne family is going to like what the sun reveals." I found Wolfe staring at the small table that sits between the two bookshelves on the far wall, the one that usually holds a silver tray and a crystal decanter of old brandy. The tray was still there, but the decanter had been moved 6 inches to the left, and the stopper was resting on the wood instead of in the bottle. To anyone else, it looked like a careless guest had helped themselves to a drink. To Wolfe, it was an act of war. His eyes were narrowed to slits, and his fingers were motionless on the arms of his chair, a sign that he was beyond mere irritation and had reached a state of cold, analytical fury. "Archie," he said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration, "I do not believe you had a drink before you left for the Thorne estate." "I didn't," I said, stepping closer. I looked at the decanter. The level of the brandy hadn't changed, but there was a faint, nearly invisible smudge on the crystal just below the neck, and Fritz doesn't leave stoppers on the table. He says it ruins the finish. Which of our guests decided to play bartender? "None of them," Wolfe replied. "They have been under my observation in the front room, and I have been in this chair since you departed." Yet the decanter was moved. A man seeking refreshment did not move it. Someone seeking a distraction, or perhaps a hiding place, moved it. Examine the drawer of the stand. I pulled out the small drawer beneath the tray. It usually held a deck of cards and a corkscrew. Now it was empty, save for a small, jagged piece of what looked like heavy parchment. I picked it up with a pair of tweezers from my desk. It was a corner of a page, burnt at the edges, with a single word visible in faded, iron-gall ink: Montenegro. "The original diary," I muttered. "Someone didn't just take it from the estate, they brought a piece of it here. Or they brought the whole thing and decided this Brownstone was the perfect place to dispose of the evidence while we were busy looking at the heirs. The trespass is subtle, Archie, but it is absolute," Wolfe said. "While I was presiding over that dismal lunch, and while you were chasing shadows in the fog, someone entered this room. They did not use the front door, nor did they use the service entrance, for Fritz was in the kitchen and would have heard the latch. They used the secondary access plant room elevator. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October mist. The plant room elevator is Wolfe's private line to his orchids, a direct shot from the roof to the office. To use it, you had to get to the roof of the Brownstone, which meant coming across the neighboring buildings or having a key to the alley gate. It was a professional move, the kind of move that suggested our thief wasn't just a disgruntled family member, but someone who knew the internal geography of the house. "So we have a ghost," I said. "A ghost who burns diaries and moves brandy bottles." "Why the decanter, though?" "It's too obvious." "It was a signal," Wolfe murmured. "A signal of contempt. Our visitor wanted me to know that my sanctuary is not as inviolable as I believe. He wanted to rattle my nerves to ensure that I would focus on the physical intrusion rather than the logical one. He has failed." The scrap of paper tells the story. Montenegro was the site of Elias Thorne's first shipping contract in 1914. It is the foundation of the Thorne fortune, and evidently the foundation of the Thorne lie. I sat at my desk and looked at the suspects in the front room through the open door. Sterling was pacing like a caged tiger, Vivian was examining her fingernails, and Vane was staring into the fog. None of them looked like they had just climbed a fire escape and manipulated a private elevator, but one of them had a partner, or a tool, who was currently laughing at us from the mist. "The vellum I found," I said, lowered my voice. "Vane bought it." Sterling looked for the ink. Vivian hired a muscle. "But the diary piece in our drawer, that changes the math. If they wanted the diary destroyed, they could have done it anywhere. Why bring it here?" "To frame the investigator, Archie. If the original is found charred in my office, Mrs. Thorne's check becomes a liability, and my reputation becomes a smoking ruin. The forger doesn't just want to rewrite history, he wants to delete the man who might prove him wrong." Wolfe leaned forward, his bulk settling with a grim finality. The subtle trespass had turned a theft into a personal vendetta. The displaced decanter was a challenge, a glove thrown at his feet, and I knew that Wolfe wouldn't rest until Head identified the hand that threw it. "Archie, tell Saul Panzer to meet you at the corner of 34th and 9th. I want the roof checked, and I want a list of every person who has visited the Thorne lawyer's office in the last 48 hours. Fog is no longer an excuse. If someone wishes to play at being a phantom in my house, I shall ensure the transition to a ghost is permanent." I grabbed my hat. The game had just moved from the Thorne library to our own backyard, and the stakes were no longer just about honor. They were about the sanctity of the Brownstone itself. As I headed for the hall, I saw the decanter, one last to me a silent reminder that someone was watching us from the shadows, waiting for the fog to swallow the truth for good. The fog had thickened into a soup so heavy that the streetlights on 35th Street were reduced to dim, orange smudges in a grey void. I was back at my desk after the meeting with Saul Panzer, my feet damp and my mood about as bright as a rainy Monday in a cellar. Saul hadn't found a phantom on the roof, but he had found something else, a set of fresh scuff marks on the brickwork near the fire escape and a discarded cigarette butt of a brand that Eleanor Thorne definitely didn't smoke. It was a Turkish blend, expensive and rare, the kind of thing Yao'd find in a humidor belonging to someone who liked to remind the world he was superior. Wolfe was sitting in his chair, his eyes closed, his breathing so shallow he might have been a statue if not for the rhythmic tapping of his right forefinger on the arm of his chair. He was in what I call his high-altitude mode, where the world outside the Brownstone ceases to exist and everything becomes a problem in pure logic. The displaced decanter had been more than a trespass, it had been a catalyst. The Thorne family was still in the front room, their voices occasionally rising in a muffled argument that sounded like a bag of cats being shaken. The doorbell rang again at 5:40. This time, it wasn't a chime of entitlement or a staccato of panic. It was a long, steady ring that suggested someone was leaning against the button. I went to the hall, checked the chain, and opened the door. Standing on the stoop was a man I hadn't seen before, though he looked like he'd been plucked from the same social register as the rest of the Thorne circle. He was younger than Sterling, mid-30s, with a face that was handsome in a hollow, desperate way. He was soaked to the bone, his evening clothes ruined by the mist, and he was staring at the house as if it were a life raft. "I'm Gregory Vance," he gasped, his voice thin and ragged, "Julian Vane's son. I need to speak to my father, and I need to tell Mr. Wolfe that the diaries aren't what they think." I didn't let him in immediately. I've seen enough surprise witnesses to know that they usually bring more trouble than they are worth. But Wolfe's voice rumbled from the office, cutting through the damp air of the hallway. "Bring him in, Archie, and bring Mr. Vane. It seems the shadow on the stoop has a name." I ushered Gregory into the office and summoned Julian Vane from the front room. The elder Vane's face went from its usual grey neutrality to a sickly, mottled white the moment he saw his son. He didn't move toward him, he shrank back, his hands gripping the back of the red leather chair until the knuckles were white. "Gregory," Julian whispered, "what have you done?" "I couldn't let it go, father," the younger man said, his eyes darting toward Wolfe. "The gambling debts, the men in the village, they said they'd let me off if I got them something from the Thorne vault. They knew about the Montenegro journals. They knew that if the original came out, the government would dismantle the shipping line. I thought if I replaced it with the forgery, no one would notice until I could pay them back." Wolfe opened one eye, his gaze landing on Gregory like a physical weight, a touching confession of filial incompetence. But you are lying, Mr. Vance. You did not replace the diary to pay off a debt. You replaced it because your father told you. You were the tool, the man who climbed the fire escape, but the mind was the one currently standing behind that chair. Julian Vane let out a sharp, jagged sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. He's a boy, Wolfe. He's a boy who made a mistake. He is a man who smokes Turkish cigarettes, I noted, pulling the butt saw had found from my pocket and dropping it on the desk. The same brand I saw in your humidor at the office, Julian, and the same brand I smelled in the library at the Thorne estate. You didn't just buy the vellum, you coached the performance. The pressure in the room was suddenly immense. The Thorne family, hearing the commotion, had crowded into the doorway of the office. Sterling looked like he was about to explode, and Vivian had a look of pure, cold fascination on her face. The shadow on the stoop hadn't just brought a confession, he had brought the second betrayal. The decanter, Wolfe said, his voice dropping into a register of absolute command. You entered this house, Gregory, while your father was at lunch. You used the plant room elevator, a feat made possible by the key your father stole from my desk during his visit last year. You intended to hide the charred remains of the original journal in this office, to ensure that if I became too inquisitive, I would be the one holding the evidence of its destruction. But you are clumsy. You moved the decanter, and you left a scrap of the very truth you sought to burn. Julian Vane slumped into the chair, his professional mask finally shattered. The shipping line, the contracts from 1914, they were based on a bribe to the Black Hand, Wolfe. If the government found out, the Thorne name would be erased from the sea. I did it for Eleanor. I did it for the legacy. You did it for the silence that pays your salary, Wolfe snapped. And now, that silence is broken. Archie, call Saul. I want the rest of that journal found. Gregory did not burn it all. A man of his desperation would keep a few pages as insurance against his own father. The shadow has been cast, and now we shall see what the light reveals. I moved to the telephone, my eyes on the two Vanes. The case had gone from theft to honorary fratricide. The Thorne heirs were silent, watching the lawyer who had guarded their secrets for decades fall apart in front of a prehistoric dragonfly. The blizzard of lies was finally starting to clear, and as I dialed Saul's number, I knew that the next gathering in this office would be the last. The office had become a stationary theatre of the stationary. Wolfe sat behind his desk, his massive frame creating a landscape of yellow waistcoat and dark broadcloth that seemed to absorb the very light of the room. He was no longer looking at the Vanes, nor at the Thorne siblings who stood paralyzed in the doorway. He was looking at the amber paperweight, his eyes tracking the prehistoric dragonfly, as if it were about to twitch its wings and provide the final testimony. The air was thick with the smell of wet wool and the sharp, acrid scent of Turkish tobacco that still clung to Gregory Vance's clothes. Doubt is a corrosive agent, Mr. Thorne, Wolfe said, his voice a low, rhythmic vibration that seemed to bypass the ears and settle directly in the bone. It does not merely destroy, it transforms. You came here today doubting your mother's sanity. Miss Vivian doubted her brother's competence. And Mr. Vane, you came here doubting my ability to see past the fog you so carefully cultivated. You have all been so busy doubting each other that you failed to doubt the one thing that remained perfectly still. The motive. I leaned against the wall by the door, keeping an eye on the hallway. The brownstone felt tight, as if the walls were leaning in to hear the verdict. Sterling Thorne stepped forward, his jaw tight. We've heard enough, Wolfe. Vane's son has confessed. The lawyer helped him. It's a sordid little tale of embezzlement and cover-ups. Call the police, and let's get my mother out of this madhouse. Embezzlement is a secondary infection, Mr. Thorne, Wolfe countered, his eyes snapping open. It is the symptom, not the cause. You are remarkably eager to close the book now that a convenient villain has been provided. But logic is not a door you can shut simply because the draft is cold. Archie, tell us about the ink. The ink Sawley described at the print shop was iron gall, I said, catching Vivian's eye. She didn't look bored anymore, she looked like she wanted to be anywhere else. It's a specific recipe, one that requires a certain amount of vitriol and tannin. It's messy, it's old-fashioned, and it requires a steady hand to mix. Gregory here can barely hold a cigarette without shaking, and Julian hasn't touched a chemistry set since the Hoover administration. But someone in the Thorne family has a private laboratory in the basement of a gallery in Chelsea. Someone who knows exactly how to age a document because she's been doing it to restore 17th century sketches for 3 years. Vivian Thorne didn't move, but the colour drained from her face until she looked as pale as the silk scarf Eleanor Thorne had brought. The bored's socialite act was gone, replaced by a sharp, predatory stillness. "Vivian?" Sterling whispered, his voice cracking. "She is the orchestrator of doubt," Archie Wolfe said, leaning forward. She realized that if the original Montenegro journals were found, the shipping line would be dismantled. But she also realized that if a forgery were found done that pointed to her brother's incompetence or her lawyer's greed, the ensuing litigation would freeze the Thorne assets for a decade. In that decade, she could systematically liquidate the liquid capital she so desperately needs to cover her losses in the art market. She did not want to destroy the Thorne honor, she wanted to mortgage it. Wolfe shifted his gaze to the younger Vance. Gregory was not his father's tool. He was yours, Miss Thorne. You knew of his gambling debts. You provided the vellum which you stole from Julian's office, and the ink you brewed yourself. You even provided the key to my alley gate, which you obtained months ago under the guise of admiring my orchids. You sent him here to plant the scrap of paper and move the decanter, not to frame his father, but to create a trail of clues that would lead me directly to the conclusion that the Vanes were the culprits. You wanted a scandal, but you wanted it to be a managed one. "This is insane," Vivian said, her voice a thin, cold blade. "You're taking the word of a common investigator and a gambling addict over mine." "I am taking the word of the dragonfly," Wolfe said, gesturing to the amber. "You forgot one thing, Miss Thorne. When you gave Gregory the scrap of the Montenegro journal to burn in my office, you didn't check the reverse side. The ink you used for the forgery was iron gall, but the original journal was written with a fountain pen using a synthetic blue-black ink that wasn't invented until 1928. The original you tried to burn was itself a forgery draft you made before you perfected the technique. You were so focused on the contents of the lie that you forgot the chemistry of the truth." The room went silent. I could hear the fog dripping off the eaves outside. Vivian looked at the amber, then at Wolfe, and finally at her brother. The orchestration was falling apart. The doubt she had sowed had grown into a forest, and she was the one lost in the woods. "The diaries," Eleanor Thorne said, her voice trembling as she entered the room. "Where are the real ones, Vivian?" "They are safe, Mother," Vivian said, her voice suddenly weary. "They are in a vault Yow'll never find. Because as long as they exist, I am the only one who can keep the Thorne name from drowning." "Archie," Wolfe said, his voice like the fall of a hammer. "Call Saul. Tell him the restorative project isn't in the lawyer's office, it's in the Chelsea Gallery. I want the real journals, and I want them before the fog lifts. And Archie, bring me a fresh bottle of beer. The air in this room is finally starting to clear." I moved to the phone, my heart hammering a rhythm that had nothing to do with the damp. The orchestration of doubt was over, and the master of the Brownstone had played the final note. As I dialed Saul's number, I saw Sterling Thorne turn toward his sister, his face a mask of iron, and I knew that for the Thorne family, the real winter was just beginning. The fog had finally surrendered to a cold, needle-sharp rain that rattled against the office windows with the persistence of a creditor. Inside, the Brownstone had taken on the atmosphere of a courtroom in the dead of night. Wolfe had not moved from his chair, but the air around him seemed to have tightened, pulled taut by the invisible strings of his deduction. The Thorne family and the Vanes were no longer a group of visitors. They were the disinherited, stripped of their pretenses, and left to face the monumental bulk of the man who had seen through their collective fog. Sterling Thorne stood by the globe, his hands clenched so tightly the knuckles looked like white stones. Vivian remained near the bookshelves, her face a mask of elegant ruin, while the Vansfather and son sat together in a miserable heap of shared failure. Eleanor Thorne, the only one who still possessed a shred of dignity, sat in the red leather chair, her eyes fixed on the amber paperweight as if it were the only solid thing left in the world. "We are gathered here," Wolfe began, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that seemed to emanate from the floorboards themselves, "to witness the final collapse of a structure built on the shifting sands of vanity. You speak of the Thorne honor as if it were a physical asset, something to be traded, forged, or hidden in a vault. But honor is not a commodity, Mr. Thorne. It is a condition, and in this room, the condition is terminal." He turned his eyes toward Vivian, who met his gaze with a defiance that was rapidly losing its edge. You, Miss Thorne, were the most ambitious of the lot. You did not merely want to hide a secret, you wanted to own it. You realized that the real Montenegro journals were a leash, and you intended to hold that leash for the next decade. But you made the mistake of assuming that I would be satisfied with a confession. I am never satisfied with a confession, I am only satisfied with the truth. The doorbell rang at 7:14. It was Saul Panzer, and even through the heavy oak door, I could tell by the rhythm of the chime that he wasn't empty-handed. I went to the hall, admitted him, and watched him wipe the rain off his face. He was carrying a small, waterproof satchel, and the look on his face told me everything I needed to know. I led him into the office. Saul didn't waste time with a greeting. He placed the satchel on Wolfe's desk and stepped back, his eyes moving over the room with their habitual sharp intensity. The Chelsea gallery was quiet. Mr. Wolfe. The safe wasn't behind the paintings, it was on the floor of the restoration room, beneath a crate of Italian vellum. These were the only items inside. Wolfe opened the satchel. He pulled out 3 leather-bound volumes, their covers dark and worn, smelling of old salt and cedar. These were the real Montenegro journals. Beside them, he placed a stack of unpaid invoices from a dozen European art dealers, all addressed to Vivian Thorne. The evidence was no longer a theory, it was a physical weight on the desk. The gathering of the disinherited is complete, Wolfe said, his voice dropping into a register of absolute finality. Sterling, you are disinheriting your authority, for you were willing to let a lawyer be scapegoated to save your pride. Julian, you are disinheriting your reputation, for you allowed your son to be a thief to protect your employer's secrets. And you, Miss Thorne, are disinherited of your freedom. The forgery was a crime against your family, but the theft and the attempt to frame this house are crimes against the law. Sterling stepped toward his sister, his voice a ragged whisper. Why, Vivian? We would have cared for you. We always have. Take care of me? Vivian spat, the mask finally falling away to reveal a raw, jagged resentment. I was the daughter who was supposed to be seen and not heard. I was the one who had to beg for every penny while you played at being a titan of industry. I didn't want to be taken care of, Sterling. I wanted to be the one who decided who got what. I wanted the power that Father never thought I was smart enough to handle. Wolfe leaned back, his interlaced fingers resting on the expanse of his yellow waistcoat. Power is a dangerous toy for those who do not understand its mechanics, Miss Thorne. You thought you could orchestrate a symphony of doubt, but you were playing in a room full of mirrors. Every move you made to hide your tracks only served to illuminate them. I looked at Eleanor Thorne. She hadn't said a word, but she was looking at her daughter with a sorrow so profound it made the room feel even colder than the rain outside. She reached out and touched the amber paperweight, her fingers tracing the prehistoric dragonfly. The truth is preserved, Mr. Wolfe, she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes, just as I asked. But I did not realize that the truth would be so bitter. The truth is rarely sweet, Mrs. Thorne, Wolfe replied, his eyes softening just a fraction. It is merely necessary. It is the only thing that survives the fog. I moved toward the desk, ready to take the journals and the invoices into my keeping. The pressure in the room had finally broken, leaving behind a vacuum of exhausted silence. The game was over, the mastermind was exposed, and the Brownstone was about to be a sanctuary once more. As Wolfe reached for the bell to summon Fritz, I knew that the next sound we heard would be the arrival of the police. The disinherited were about to find a new home, and it wouldn't have any mahogany or silk. Archie, Wolfe said, his voice regaining its habitual, crisp authority. Call Inspector Cramer. Tell him to bring a large car and a patient sergeant. We have a restoration project that is finally complete. I took the phone, my eyes on Vivian. She was looking at the journals on the desk, her expression one of hollow, frozen defeat. The orchestration was over, and the master of the Brownstone had taken the final bow. The office was no longer a theatre, it had become a cage, and the bars were the cold, hard facts that Nero Wolfe had laid out on the mahogany desk. Inspector Cramer had arrived 10 minutes ago, bringing with him a gust of wet October air and a look of deep-seated suspicion that usually targeted Wolfe, but was currently fixed on Vivian Thorne. He stood by the globe, his blue overcoat dripping onto the rug, while his sergeant stood by the door, looking like a man who had seen everything and found most of it disappointing. The transparency of guilt was now absolute, as clear as the amber that held the dragonfly, and the room was silent except for the rhythmic, heavy breathing of Sterling Thorne. Wolfe had not moved. He sat behind his desk, a glass of beer at his elbow, watching Cramer with the detached interest of a man watching a play he has already reviewed. He adjusted his bulk in the chair, a movement that seemed to signal the final act. "You see, Inspector," Wolfe began, his voice a low, vibrating hum that seemed to rattle the pens on my desk. The transparency of this crime was obscured by its own complexity. Miss Thorne did not merely want to steal a diary, she wanted to steal a narrative. She understood that in Thorne's world, the appearance of honor is more valuable than honor itself. By creating a forgery that suggested her father's betrayal, she ensured that the family would be too terrified of the public exposure to look closely at the private theft. Cramer took a cigar out of his pocket, looked at it with a grimace, and put it back. "So the kid, Gregory, was just a delivery boy. He's the one who broke in here, Wolfe. That's a felony no matter who told him to do it. He is a tool, Inspector, and a dull one at that," Wolfe snapped. "But the hand that guided him is the one currently wearing a diamond that could pay for a precinct's heating bill. Miss Thorne provided the vellum, the iron-gall ink, and the logistical map of this house. She even provided the Turkish cigarettes, which she planted in the library in Gregory's pocket to ensure that the trail would lead back to her own lawyer. She wanted the doubt to be directed everywhere but at herself." Vivian Thorne stood up, her face a mask of elegant ruin. She didn't look at her mother, who was still weeping silently into a lace handkerchief. She looked at Wolfe, and for the first time, I saw the raw, jagged edge of the woman behind the socialite. It was my name, too. I was the one who kept the gallery going while Sterling played at being a mogul. I was the one who realized that father's legacy was just a collection of bribes and backroom deals. Why should I be the only one to starve when the ship goes down? Because you were the only one willing to sink the ship to save your own jewelry, Vivian, Sterling said, his voice a ragged whisper. "We would have helped you. You only had to ask." "Ask?" Vivian let out a sharp, hysterical laugh, "and be reminded for another 40 years that I am a liability." "No, Sterling, I wanted the leverage. I wanted the journals so that every time you looked at me, you'd remember who held the key to your vault." Wolfe leaned back, his interlaced fingers resting on the expanse of his yellow waistcoat. "And that, Inspector, is guilt transparency. It is not always found in a fingerprint or hairline. It is found in the motive that is too large to be hidden." Miss Thorne's desperation was a beacon that even the fog of her own deception could not mask. She believed that by manipulating the past she could control the future, but she forgot that the truth has a chemical memory. The iron-gall ink she used for her forgery was her own death warrant. Cramer nodded toward the sergeant. "Take her, and take the kid. Well, sort out the embezzlement charges and the breaking and entering down at the house. As for the lawyer and the shipping mogul here, I suggest you stay close to a phone. I am going to have a lot of questions about these political arrangements in Montenegro." As the sergeant led Vivian and Gregory toward the hall, the office felt strangely quiet. The pressure that had been building since Mrs. Thorne first walked in with that silk-wrapped amber had finally broken. The transparency was complete. The dragonfly was still in its resin, unchanged by the drama that had swirled around it, a silent witness to a truth that had finally been preserved. I moved to the desk and picked up the prehistoric dragonfly, feeling its weight. It was heavy, solid, and indifferent to the Thorne family's ruin. "The transparency of guilt," I mused, looking at Wolfe. "It's a nice phrase, sir, but I think you just like the way the ink reacted to the tannin. You're a scientist at heart, even if you'd rather be a chef." Wolfe didn't answer. He was already looking toward the dining room door, where the scent of Fritz roasting lamb was beginning to drift through the hallway. The case was over, the master had spoken, and the only thing left was the aftermath. He reached for the bell to summon Fritz, his fingers steady, his mind already beginning to drift toward the menu. "Archie, tell Fritz we shall require the 1906 Armagnac. A palate cleansed by justice requires a specific kind of fire to finish the meal. And Archie, take that fossil off my desk. It has served its purpose as a witness. Now, it is merely a reminder of the time we have wasted on the Thorne honor." I put the amber back in its silk scarf and headed for the hall. The rain was still drumming against the glass, but the house felt warm again. Transparency was gone, replaced by the comfortable, familiar shades of brownstone. As I dialed the final numbers for the evening, I knew that for Nero Wolfe, the real world was once again becoming a distant, irrelevant rumor. The front door closed with a heavy, final thud that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards, signaling that Inspector Cramer, his soggy cigars, and the wreckage of the Thorne dynasty had finally vacated the premises. I stood in the hallway for a moment, letting the silence of the brownstone settle over me like a warm blanket. The rain was still lashing against the oak door, but inside, the air had already begun to lose the sharp, metallic tang of tension and Turkish tobacco. I walked back into the office and found Wolfe exactly where I had left him, though he had already pushed the leather-bound journals and the incriminating invoices to the far corner of his desk as if they were yesterday's newspapers. He was currently leaning back, his eyes half closed, his fingers performing a slow, rhythmic dance on the arms of his chair. "The house is empty, sir," I reported, leaning against the doorframe and watching the shadows dance on the bookshelves. "The Vanes are in the back of one squad car, and Vivian Thorne is in another, looking like she's already planning how to sue the city for the quality of the upholstery. Sterling and his mother left in a private car. I think Eleanor Thorne is going to spend the night wondering how she managed to raise a forger and a tyrant under the same roof." Wolfe did not look up, a biological mystery, Archie, and one that does not concern me. The propagation of human folly is a constant, much like the laws of thermodynamics. It is only the specific velocity of the collapse that varies. I'm more concerned with lamb breeding. Fritz has been keeping it at a precise temperature for 40 minutes, and I suspect his patience is reaching its limit. As if summoned by the mention of his name, Fritz appeared in the doorway, his white apron pristine, his face showing the quiet relief of a man whose kitchen has survived a siege. He looked at Wolfe and gave a slight, respectful nod. "The dinner is served, Mr. Wolfe. The leg of lamb with the rosemary and garlic crust, and the braised endives you requested." Wolfe rose from his chair, a slow and majestic process of shifting mass that always reminded me of a mountain deciding to move to a slightly better climate. He adjusted his yellow waistcoat, smoothed the front of his jacket, and looked at the amber paperweight one last time. "Excellent, Fritz, and we shall require the large napkins. Justice is a messy business, but it should never be allowed to interfere with the enjoyment of a proper roast." We moved into the dining room where the candlelight was reflecting off the silver and the dark wood, creating an atmosphere of such profound peace that the events of the afternoon seemed like a dream. For the first 20 minutes, there was no talk of Montenegro, Iron ink, or the anatomy of a betrayal. Wolfe ate with a focused, reverent appreciation that made every bite seem like a tribute to the order of the universe. It wasn't until the endives were a memory and the wine had been poured for the final time that he leaned back, his glass of Montrachet catching the golden light. "It is a curious reflection on the human palate, Archie," Wolfe murmured, his voice a low, settled rumble that seemed to harmonize with the sound of the rain. "How a man like Arthur Penhaligon or a woman like Vivian Thorne can spend their lives pursuing the flavor of power, only to find that it leaves a permanent bitterness on the tongue. They seek the transparency of control, yet they only achieve the opacity of guilt. They are like that dragonfly in the amber frozen in a moment of their own making, unable to move, unable to change, and ultimately unable to breathe." "I think Vivian would have settled for the money," I said, swirling the wine in my glass. "She didn't want to be frozen, she wanted to be liquid. She just didn't realize that when you start melting the family honor, you usually end up drowning in it. But you have to admit, sir, the forgery was a work of art. If she hadn't messed up the ink chemistry on that one scrap, we might still be arguing about whether your brandy was poisoned." Wolfe offered a grunt that was as close to a chuckle as he ever allowed himself. "Artistry without accuracy is merely a lie in a fancy coat, Archie. She understood the appearance of the past, but she did not understand its substance. She treated history as a draft to be edited, forgetting that the truth is written in a medium that does not respond to an eraser. Fritz's excellent lamb does cleanse not my palate just, but by the restoration of a logical sequence. The brownstone is once again a sanctuary of reason, and a sanctuary of $5,000, I reminded him. I'll deposit the check in the morning, right after I make sure the roof doesn't have any more Turkish cigarette butts on it. I think I'll also buy a new decanter. The one the ghost moved still feels a little haunted to me. Wolfe raised his glass in a silent toast to the room. A sensible precaution, Archie. Though the haunting is not in the glass, but in the memory of the intrusion. We shall let the night air take care of the rest. For now, the rain is sufficient to wash the streets, and the brandy is sufficient to warm the heart. I leaned back, feeling the warmth of the room and the steady, reliable heartbeat of the house. The thorn case was a closed book, the dragonfly was back in its silk-wrapped box, and the only thing that mattered was the quiet, orderly rhythm of 35th Street. As I watched Wolfe take a final, appreciative sip of his Armagnac, I knew that for at least a few hours, the world was exactly as it was meant to be. "I'll tell you one thing, boss," I said, reaching for a piece of Stilton. "If I ever decide to freeze myself in amber, I'll make sure I am holding a glass of milk. It makes for a much better legacy." Wolfe's eyes flickered with a hint of amusement. "A quip, Archie, a minor one, but it will serve. Now, let's finish the wine silently. I have a book on the Ottoman treasury that has been waiting for me since 10:14 this morning, and I do not wish to keep the Sultan waiting any longer." I nodded and settled into the silence. The case was over, the master was at peace, and the Brownstone was ours again.